Hello and welcome to Spill the Tea. True Stories, the place where real life is more fascinating than fiction. Sit back, pour yourself a cup of tea, and let's dive into the moments that stay with us forever. We're starting now. Eleanor stepped out of the stuffy house into the spring yard, and the bright sun instantly made her squint. Shielding her eyes with her palm, she looked around, and a smile blossomed on her lips all by itself. True beauty stretched all around. Apple trees stood like brides, generously strewn with delicate pink blossoms. The emerald green of the lawns was a feast for the eyes, and overhead stretched a bottomless blue sky with fluffy white clouds. On the sun-drenched playground, a little girl soared on a swing like a butterfly. She was adorable in her light white sundress, her long chestnut hair sometimes flying up to the sky, sometimes falling down like a waterfall. Eleanor recognized her immediately, and, unable to contain her tenderness, smiled. "So this is where you are, my joy," she whispered softly, and headed towards the swings. The little one, noticing Eleanor approaching, burst into ringing laughter, and the swing, obeying her wish, began to slow its flight. The girl looked directly at Eleanor, her eyes shining with anticipation. "Is it time for breakfast already?" she asked brightly, fidgeting impatiently on the seat. Eleanor nodded, and once again her heart ached at the thought of how different this little one's childhood could have been. The girl, who is now only 3 years old, doesn't even suspect the shadow of misfortune that hung over her a few years ago. Perhaps one day her parents will tell her the story, but now Annie lives in a world of happiness, surrounded by love and care. She is bathed in the tenderness of her loved ones, enjoys the beauty of nature and the serenity of each day, and always, invisibly present beside her, is Eleanor, her guardian angel. Annie's mother and father are sure that Eleanor played a key role in their daughter's fate, and they are endlessly grateful to her for it. They consider her their savior, a person who appeared at the right moment and changed everything for the better. This certainty and gratitude were more precious to Eleanor than any words. Appearance had never been Eleanor's strong suit, not in childhood, not in youth, not in maturity. In her youth, she suffered greatly because of it, spending hours looking at her expressionless face in the mirror. A shapeless nose, small gray eyes, thin lips, and full cheeks. She wasn't ugly, but she couldn't be called pretty either. Her figure was also quite ordinary: short stature, full hips, and almost no waist. Nature seemed to have been stingy with bright colors for Eleanor, giving her medium brown hair, pale eyelashes, and pale skin. Even cosmetics, on which she spent a lot of time and money, couldn't make her appearance even slightly remarkable. Things were quite different for her friends, such as Alice, a big-eyed beauty with a thick braid, or Veronica, a slender and striking classmate. Crowds of boys flocked around them. They were always the center of attention. It seemed that with such looks, all the doors of the world were open to them, unlike Eleanor, who felt invisible. Eleanor didn't shine in her studies either. Her academic abilities were quite average. She understood that she wasn't destined to be an excellent student like Kate, whom everyone respected for her intelligence and willingness to help with homework. Eleanor felt like a gray mediocrity, and this feeling caused her deep suffering. She saw how easily everything came to others, while she had to put in enormous effort. Her parents didn't understand or share their daughter's worries about her appearance. Her mother, looking at the despondent Eleanor, would list: healthy, arms and legs intact, eyes see, ears hear. Look how many disabled people and people with real defects there are around, and don't anger God. Her father would add, "You can't drink water from a face. The main thing is intelligence. But a C in algebra is a problem. Worry about that." Her parents believed that caring about appearance was foolishness and a whim, and advised Eleanor to focus on her studies. The girl tried, deciding that if she wasn't lucky with her looks, she needed to become an outstanding specialist. But no matter how much she sat over textbooks, formulas remained a mystery, dates got mixed up, and rules seemed like a set of meaningless words. Eleanor also had no special talents. She didn't sing, didn't play instruments, didn't shine in sports. Whatever she tried, nothing turned out better than it did for others. In childhood, she tried many clubs in search of her calling, but never found her life's work. In adolescence, Eleanor often cried from the feeling of her own grayness and mediocrity. She tried so hard, but the result was always average or below average. Her parents not only didn't support her, but sometimes even scolded her for her despondency, considering it a manifestation of pride. "Not everyone can be beauties and talents," her mother would say angrily, "but you're healthy and strong. The country rests on people like you, not on those big-eyed dragonflies." These words only made Eleanor feel worse, because more than anything in the world, she wanted to be just such a big-eyed dragonfly. Boys paid no attention to her, and she considered this natural. Why would they want her when there were bright Alices and Veronicas, or smart Kate, whom everyone turned to for help? It was especially painful to see Alex, a classmate whose sight made her heart stop, look at other girls as if he didn't notice her. Sometimes he even forgot to say hello when passing by, as if she were empty space. Eleanor was angry at fate and her parents for her expressionless genes, sometimes dreamed of plastic surgery, but more often just sighed, looking at her beautiful classmates, and thought about the unfairness of life. The only thing Eleanor liked from about the age of 10 was interacting with young children. Their spontaneity, funny antics, and trustfulness always lifted her spirits. It was so easy to surprise and delight them, and they didn't pay attention to her appearance or school performance. Children felt her sincere joy and responded with happy smiles, ringing laughter, and genuine love. Mothers in the yard were always happy when Eleanor came out of the building, because the little ones would immediately run to her. She knew how to organize fun games, knew how to engage them, and for a long time became the center of their small universe. Children even cried when their parents tried to take them home in the middle of a game. "You have a talent," said a young mother once, whose capricious son transformed when he was with Eleanor. Talent? Eleanor didn't believe her ears then, thinking she had misheard. It seemed to her that anyone could look after little ones, and it didn't require special abilities. "Perhaps you could be a good kindergarten teacher," the boy's mother added thoughtfully, her child clinging trustfully to her hand. Then, at 14, Eleanor first seriously thought about her future profession. The idea of becoming a kindergarten teacher seemed appealing to her. She really enjoyed communicating with children, and, importantly, she was good at it. High school graduation was not far off, and Eleanor already knew she wouldn't go to the 10th grade, having realized that school wasn't her calling. Her parents supported her decision to go to college after 9th grade. "That's right. No need to waste time in school," her father approved. "You'll have a profession in your hands. You won't be lost." "We're not particularly capable of academics," her mother sighed. "Looks like you can't jump above your head. None of us have higher education, and it seems you won't either." Eleanor knew her mother had hoped for a different outcome, dreaming that her daughter would make something of herself. But Eleanor's school performance dispelled these ambitions, and her mother, without hiding her disappointment, caused her daughter pain. However, when Eleanor voiced her desire to become a kindergarten teacher, her parents expressed dissatisfaction. "What kind of profession is that? Wiping snot for other people's children for pennies," her father fumed. Her mother agreed. "Salaries are tiny, responsibility is huge, and parents, you know what they can be like? They won't give you a moment's peace." So Eleanor went to study to be a sewing machine operator, because this profession, in her parents' opinion, was supposed to bring her happiness. "Always with money, always needed by people," her mother ticked off on her fingers, listing the advantages of being a seamstress. "You can take on extra work, sew for your own family. What a saving!" Studying was hard for Eleanor. Most of her classmates' work went smoothly, but hers invariably resulted in crooked seams and patterns. With time, thanks to perseverance, she learned, but remained at an average level, yet her parents were satisfied. Eleanor no longer fussed with little ones. having grown up and being busy with her studies. But when she interacted with the children of acquaintances, she blossomed. Her mother, seeing her interest, joked, "We'll have many grandchildren, father." Her father nodded. "I don't mind, as long as she finds a decent son-in-law who can provide for the whole brood." Eleanor's parents' dreams, however, did not come true. Eleanor herself dreamed of children from early youth, unable to imagine life without the ringing laughter and the patter of little feet, but she never had many admirers. She realized this fact early on, but with age, young men began to pay attention to her. They weren't handsome or leaders, like her former classmate Alex, but Eleanor was still happy, feeling that she had interested a guy. Such a guy was Steve, a neighbor's son whom Eleanor had known since childhood. He was as unremarkable as she was, had graduated from a construction college, worked at a factory, and inherited his grandmother's one-room apartment. Under pressure from relatives, he decided it was time to get married, and his choice fell on Eleanor, a modest, hard-working, thrifty girl from a decent family without special demands. Perhaps he dreamed of bright stars, but he realistically assessed his chances, understanding that with Eleanor, a calm and quiet life awaited him. One day, Steve met Eleanor at the bus stop when she was returning from the sewing factory where she had recently started working. "Hi," he smiled so easily, as if they were close friends. A surprised Eleanor greeted him back, and Steve said he had been waiting for her for half an hour, which made her heart pound. Could it be that a guy had noticed her for the first time, and even did such a thing for her? Of course, she allowed him to walk her home. Steve walked beside her, talking about work and school, asking her questions, and then took her hand, a gentle gesture that said a lot. After walking Eleanor to her building, he shyly suggested, "Are you free tomorrow? There's a new movie with Jim Carrey at the cinema. Maybe we could go?" "I love that actor," Eleanor smiled broadly. "Of course we'll go." That evening, Eleanor couldn't sleep for a long time, remembering the walk with Steve. He looked at her like no one had before, interested, attentive, as if he saw not an unattractive girl, but someone else. It was incredibly pleasant, and Eleanor finally felt pretty, attractive, worthy of love and attention, almost like Alice. Steve himself had never aroused strong feelings in her, but today he appeared in a different light, decisive and gentle. She felt strength and reliability in him. When had he managed to grow up and turn into a real man? The next day in the dark cinema hall, Steve plucked up the courage and kissed Eleanor. From surprise and pleasure, her head spun. It was her first kiss, and she finally felt feminine. A real miracle. "I like you very much," Steve said softly. "Let's go out." "Let's," Eleanor agreed immediately, feeling her cheeks burning in the dark. They officially became a couple, and Eleanor's life changed dramatically. There were dates, flowers, trips to the cinema and cafes, birthdays of Steve's friends, kisses and walks under the moon. All this lifted her mood and made her feel special. Eleanor tried not to notice that Steve wasn't the hero of her romance, although perhaps she was a little in love with him, or at least grateful for showing her what it was like to be special and attractive. And Eleanor finally calmed down. From an early age, when other girls dreamed of careers or expensive cars, she imagined herself as a mother of many children. As she grew older, she became seriously worried that, being so gray and unremarkable, surrounded by beauties, she would never find a man willing to marry her and would remain alone. And then Steve appeared, attentive, caring, and seemingly in love. The fear of being alone evaporated, and her cherished dreams of family and children finally had a chance to become reality. About a year later, walking along the embankment after the cinema, Steve suddenly blurted out, "Eleanor, let's make it official. I have a place to live, my apartment, and I'm so tired of being alone." The proposal wasn't the most romantic, but Eleanor happily agreed, because everything was leading up to this. They had a modest wedding. Eleanor's mother secretly wiped away tears. Her mother-in-law smiled tightly, and the fathers, engrossed in conversation and drinking, didn't show much interest. The toastmaster, the tipsy guests, the silly contests, everything went as it should. But Eleanor only dreamed of this tedious day ending as soon as possible. At home, in Steve's apartment where they were to live, the bride took off her fluffy, itchy dress with relief and let down her tight hairstyle. The tired, drunken groom was already snoring loudly. Thus began the family life of Steve and Eleanor. Both worked, returned home, he lay down in front of the TV, she went to prepare dinner, a typical average family. Steve, having become a legal husband, considered his mission accomplished, stopped inviting her anywhere, and only complimented her cooking. Eleanor was basically satisfied. Their life was ordinary, no better or worse than others. The main thing was that she was with a husband, not an old maid, and soon, as she hoped, children would appear, and her cherished dream would come true. Everything else seemed not so important. But nothing worked out with children. A year passed, then 2, 3, and parents on both sides hinted that they wanted to become grandparents. Eleanor wholeheartedly wanted to fulfill their, and, most importantly, her own dream. But it just didn't happen. Steve didn't particularly suffer from the lack of heirs. His wife took care of him, fed him, cleaned, ironed his clothes, and he didn't want children to take away her time for these duties. "It's nothing terrible. People live without children," he would reassure his wife. In response to these words, Eleanor wanted to hit Steve with something heavy because she had only married to become a mother. Her mother-in-law signed Eleanor up for an examination, shaking her head. "Something must be wrong with you." It was hurtful to hear this. It seemed Steve's relatives considered her defective, and her own parents were no better. "Oh, it seems you inherited your grandmother's genes," her mother lamented. "Your father's aunt, she was infertile. You must have taken after her." Eleanor underwent the examination, and it turned out she was perfectly fine. "Perhaps the reason is with your husband, or incompatibility," the doctor shrugged. "Your husband needs an examination." But Steve flatly refused. "What nonsense! What do I have to do with it? There were no problems with men in our family. I'm not going." Eleanor pleaded, persuaded, even cried, to no avail. Steve considered visiting the clinic a humiliation, and his family supported him. "She probably messed around when she was young, didn't take care of herself, and now she's trying to blame us," her mother-in-law said spitefully once. This was so painful and offensive that Eleanor didn't know what to say. Relations with Steve became colder and colder. There were almost none. They lived like neighbors. Therefore, Eleanor was hardly surprised, and certainly not upset by the news that Steve had someone else. He confessed everything directly, without mincing words. "Eleanor, you'll have to move out. You have a week. We're getting divorced." "What?" The woman didn't understand. "That's right. I have someone else from work, from the institute. She's already pregnant with my child. So we're getting divorced." "Well, that's news," Eleanor gasped. "That's the news," Steve agreed. "See, I'm normal, and you were dragging me to the hospital. It's you who can't have children, but I'm fine in that regard. We're expecting twins." "But I thought you didn't want children," Eleanor clarified. "Didn't want them then. Want them now," her almost ex-husband retorted. "A person needs heirs, offspring." Eleanor returned to her aging parents' house. Where else could she go? The foolish, absurd marriage lasted almost 10 years, longer than many of her friends who married the same year. Only almost all of them had managed to become mothers, and Eleanor envied them. Raising children alone is hard, but it's better than living without your own little ones. Then Eleanor still had hope. She was barely 35, an age that allowed her to become a mother. But she understood that she needed to act, to do something to fulfill her dream. At the very least, she needed a man, because a child should have a father. This wasn't working out. Eleanor again felt like a gray mediocrity, a shadow, invisible to the opposite sex. By 35, she had gained weight, her hair had thinned, and the first wrinkles had appeared. She never learned to dress stylishly. Nothing fit her awkward figure, and the charm of youth was irrevocably gone. Nevertheless, Eleanor had a few more romances in her life that didn't end in anything serious. She met her 45th birthday alone, on a Monday. Her parents were no longer alive by then. First, her father died of a heart attack, and 2 years later, her mother followed. Enduring such losses alone was very difficult. She had friends, but they all had their own families, children, and they couldn't devote all their time to her, and Eleanor didn't demand it, understanding everything. On her birthday, on the way home from work, she bought an expensive cake and candles. Sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, looking at the flames, she thought about her failed life. The best years were behind her. Time had flown by quickly. Her cherished dream hadn't come true. No children, and there wouldn't be any now. No husband, no close person to lean on. On the other hand, she was healthy, still young. She had a home and a stable job. Maybe there was nothing to complain about. But why then was her soul so sad and gloomy? She didn't want to sit alone in the kitchen on such a day. She decided to go to the mall, walk around the shops, sit in a cafe, cheer herself up. In a crowd of people, it's impossible to feel lonely. It's bright, noisy, cheerful, and beautiful there, because the new year is coming soon, and the city is already dressed up. Eleanor quickly got ready, called a taxi. If she was going out, she was going out properly. 10 minutes later, she was at the mall, where music was blaring. People were choosing gifts. Many were with children. Eleanor admired the families, so happy, not even realizing their happiness. Here, a young mother irritably scolds her 3-year-old son for whining. But he's just tired. How can she not understand that? And here, young parents scold their 6-year-old daughter, who is crying and asking for a doll. Oh, if Eleanor had a child, she would never scold them, because everything can be explained calmly. All it takes is patience and attention. Eleanor went to the clothing department in search of something interesting for the office party, but only got upset. No matter what she put on, she didn't look the way she wanted to. She had to leave without buying anything. But at the pastry shop, she spent a significant amount, unable to resist her favorite eclairs and pastries, although a cake was waiting at home. Yes, Eleanor had a sweet tooth. She needed to get pleasure from something. She knew about the harm of sugar, but she couldn't help it. A colleague once remarked that Eleanor was eating her stress away, and perhaps that was true. Her whole life was a kind of stress. Eleanor couldn't come to terms with her loneliness and unsettled life. Panic seized her at the thought of old age in an empty, cold house. That time was not far off. Sighing, she chased away the unpleasant thoughts and looked at her watch. It was late. The center would close soon. It was time to go back, especially since tomorrow was a work day. The woman stepped out onto the porch, scanned the parking lot for a taxi. She didn't want to walk to the bus stop in such darkness and bad weather. The frost was getting stronger. The sky was clear, studded with bright stars. It would probably be even colder tomorrow. She should hang a bird feeder. It's hard for those who are forced to live on the street in such cold. Never mind birds and animals, they're used to it. But people. There were many homeless people in their city. Eleanor often saw them at bus stops or near garbage cans. Those were the ones who had it hard. Those were the ones who should be sad, not her, who had a warm, cozy home from her parents. Eleanor finally spotted a taxi with the emblem of the local taxi company and hurried towards it, afraid someone else would take it. That's when she noticed her. A thin girl in a thin jacket, clearly not for the season, stretched over a huge belly. The girl stood by the fire escape trying to warm up. She stamped her feet, rubbed her hands, shivered. She was clearly freezing in her spring jacket. Judging by her belly, she would be going to the maternity hospital soon. What was she doing outside in such a state? Eleanor became curious, and, forgetting about the taxi, she approached closer, stunned with horror when she saw her shoes, light, dirty, worn-out sneakers. Her feet must have been completely numb in them. The girl looked lost and frightened. Despair was in her beautiful dark eyes. "What's wrong?" Eleanor couldn't help but ask, her heart aching with pity for this almost still a girl. "Just cold," she replied. "So why don't you go inside? The mall is closing." "They kicked me out." The stranger lowered her eyes. "I'll just wait for the guard to turn away and slip back in. I'll hide somewhere and spend the night." "Are you homeless?" "No, I have a home, but I can't go there." "What happened?" Eleanor realized she couldn't remain indifferent. She had to help this young, beautiful creature. It was impossible to pass by. "It's a long story." The girl waved her hand, keeping her eyes on the guard, who was watching the entrance carefully, not letting anyone in. Soon the last visitors would leave, and he would close the door, leaving the girl outside. She definitely wouldn't survive the December frosty night. "Come to my place," Eleanor blurted out unexpectedly, even to herself. And immediately she was scared of her own words. Invite a complete stranger home? Who knows what she might be thinking? But looking once more at the lost, frozen, pregnant stranger, the woman understood. This was the only right decision. The girl needed to be warmed up urgently. Everything else could wait. The stranger looked at Eleanor distrustfully. "Are you serious?" "Yes, yes, of course," the woman said with newfound confidence. "I'll just call a taxi now." "Thank you so much." The girl couldn't believe her luck. "I'm embarrassed to trouble you, but there's no other way. Thank you very much." "You won't trouble me, I live alone anyway." Eleanor smiled, dialing the taxi number. They were both silent on the way. A tense silence hung in the car. At home, in the warm kitchen, with the cake in the middle of the table, everything became simpler and more natural. "Is it your birthday?" The girl smiled. How sweet she was. Fragile, big-eyed, graceful, and very young. Eleanor even doubted if she was 18. How did such a defenseless creature end up on the street on a frosty night? Where were her parents? Where was her husband or boyfriend, the child's father? How could they allow this? "My name is Sarah," the girl introduced herself, looking around. "Your place is very cozy. And I'm Eleanor. I'll make some tea and you'll tell me everything that happened, and we'll think together about how to help. Okay?" "Thank you very much." Sarah was clearly touched. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Stay for now," Eleanor smiled. "Come, I'll show you the room where you'll sleep." The woman took her guest to her parents' bedroom, where almost nothing had changed since they left. A large bed, a bookshelf, a wardrobe. "Sarah, you should be comfortable here." "What a wonderful room!" the girl exclaimed happily. Eleanor returned to the kitchen to fuss. 5 minutes later, Sarah came over, sat down at the table, propping her chin. "I suppose it's time to tell my story. You have the right to know. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to me. I don't think I would have survived the night outside." "Yes, the frost is strong today." Eleanor shook her head. "Tell me what happened. We'll figure something out." "Unlikely." The girl sighed sadly and began her story. Sarah was born in a small town, was the eldest in a large family, and looked after her younger siblings from an early age. Her parents were simple and strict, honored traditions, raised their children in unquestioning obedience, forbidding them to have their own opinions. "And I was always different from them and the younger ones," Sarah sighed. "I felt like I was in prison there. I wanted bright clothes, loud music, discos. But my father forbade everything, said that no one would marry a girl who went out like that. As if I needed that. I wanted to study. I dreamed of becoming a designer." Her parents had other plans. "What designer?" "She draws well, but you won't make money." The girl was sent to a culinary college to get a breadwinning profession. Eleanor sighed. In Sarah's story, she saw echoes of her own. After all, she too had not been allowed to fulfill her dream of becoming a kindergarten teacher. And so she had to work as a dressmaker. Then she didn't dare to disobey her parents, believing that they knew best. and Sarah did the same. When I turned 18, my father gave me away in marriage. The girl's eyes filled with sadness. She lowered her head. Sarah couldn't refuse. The matter had been decided long ago. She became the wife of 40-year-old widower Arthur, a former colleague of her father, who had once saved his life. Her father considered himself indebted. He often looked at me when he came to visit, Sarah recalled. His gaze was attentive and unpleasant, kind of sticky. It gave me goosebumps, but I couldn't have imagined that he would become my husband.
That's almost a crime, Eleanor gasped. You're 18, he's 40. You're a child, he's an adult man. How did your parents agree? They were even happy, Sarah smiled bitterly. We live in a poor town. Half the men drink, the other half work for pennies. And Arthur is a former military man. He has a house, a car, a business, a desirable groom by local standards. Only he always scared me. A look like a reptile's. He seemed to smile, kind, brought gifts. But I was afraid of him. The news of the marriage shocked Sarah. She begged her father, her mother, but they were adamant. It must be done, that's all. She resigned herself. What else was there? And back then, she was in love with her classmate Mark. It's so hard for me to believe this. Eleanor shook her head. In this day and age, in the 21st century, parents marry off their daughter against her will to an adult man. It immediately brings to mind the painting, The Unequal Marriage. I know, Sarah nodded. That's just how things are where I'm from, she continued. No one was interested in my opinion. There was no wedding. We just had a dinner at a restaurant. And then I had to go to my lawful husband's house. And so began the young Sarah's married life, essentially Arthur's domestic slave. It was hard for her to part with her childhood and become a servant. Arthur liked order, and she was supposed to maintain it. Dust or a dirty plate resulted in punishment. First, an hour-long monotonous sermon about how a wife should obey her husband, and then the worst part, he would lock her in the attic for the whole night. It was cold, dark, and scary there. I'm still afraid of the dark, Sarah admitted shyly. There was no bed or mattress in the attic. She had to sleep on the hard, cold floor. In the morning, Arthur would let her out and act as if nothing had happened. Sarah also wasn't allowed to show her feelings. Otherwise, there would be another punishment. For minor offenses, a few hours. For serious ones, for days. Of course, Sarah was afraid of the adult man. He had scared her before, and even more so now. She tried to obey him in everything, but she didn't always guess what he meant. Sometimes it seemed he was deliberately looking for a reason to find fault. Occasionally, Arthur would get drunk, alone or with friends, and then he would lose it. He would start seeing things that weren't there, shouting, threatening, throwing things at an invisible enemy. At such moments, Sarah would hide in the attic or run out into the yard. The rampage would last for several hours. Then he would calm down and fall asleep. Then Sarah would crawl out and start cleaning up so he wouldn't be furious about the mess in the morning. She didn't want to see him in that state at all. Why didn't you tell your parents about this? Eleanor gasped. Arthur must be unstable. It's dangerous to be with someone like that. He needs treatment. My parents? Sarah smiled bitterly. Who would listen to me? Arthur is a wealthy, respected man in town. And my parents considered me the most capricious, arrogant. It was useless to talk to them. They would say I thought too much of myself. Well, what if you had called doctors when he had an episode? Doctors might have taken him away until morning, and then he would have come back angry for me turning him in. I can't even imagine what he would have done to me then. After all, I still don't know what happened to his wife. No one knows. You said he was a widower? Yes, that wife, the first one, was also about 15 years younger. Not from our town. He brought her from somewhere. No friends, no relatives here. Quiet, silent, withdrawn. Now I understand why. I didn't know her very well.
I saw her sometimes in the store or on the street, and she didn't interest me. I was a child then. Kind of strange. Well, never mind. One day, returning from school, Sarah saw a crowd near Arthur's house. Turning onto the next street, she approached closer and realized a funeral. Seeing her parents in the crowd, she asked, "What happened?" "Arthur's wife died," her mother replied. How? Why? Sarah couldn't comprehend. She had seen her recently, pale, anxious, but young and healthy. "None of your business," her father said, pushing her. "Go home, don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong." That night, Sarah overheard her parents talking in the kitchen. "Still don't understand," her mother said anxiously. "How could she fall from the second floor? The railing is high." Arthur explained, "She was drunk, and drunk people do all sorts of things. Laura doesn't look like an alcoholic. Looks like it, doesn't look like it." "Are you an expert?" Her father was irritated. "The police investigated. It was an accident." "But I don't think so. Either Arthur pushed her, or she did it herself because of such a life. And it's not just me who thinks so. Neighbors heard arguing and shouting before." "When you think something, you should cross yourself," her father almost shouted. "Don't talk nonsense. The housewives are clucking and you've picked it up. Specialists conducted the investigation. An accident, period." Rumors circulated in the town for a long time. Many didn't believe it was an accident. But time passed, and the story lost its edge. Sarah was even more afraid of her father's friend since then. The news of the marriage shocked her, but she understood. There was nowhere to go. You couldn't go against your parents' will. "How could that be?" Eleanor threw up her hands. "I don't understand your parents at all. If they knew what kind of person he was, if they considered the possibility that he did something to his wife, how could they even think of giving you to him?" "But I told you, a desirable groom," Sarah said. "To become related to someone like that is a lucky ticket. All doors are open to my family now. And as for me, well, my parents have other daughters and a son." There was so much bitterness in these words that Eleanor couldn't help but hug the fragile girl tightly. Sarah immediately relaxed in her arms, as if she had been waiting for this, and then pulled away and continued her story. "About 6 months after the wedding, I realized I was expecting a child. I was scared. I didn't want this. Arthur dreamed of an heir, and I didn't want a child from that terrible man, because another prisoner would appear in our house. Our prison. Never mind me, I'm an adult. But a defenseless baby in the hands of this monster. Imagine what he could do to him." Sarah hid her pregnancy as best she could, but the shrewd Arthur noticed the changes. "I guessed," he said happily. Sarah sighed. He took her to a jewelry store so she could choose whatever she wanted. He hadn't been stingy before, but now he showered her with gifts, force-fed her fruit. He even took her to an expensive medical center where she registered. But the gifts and care didn't make her happy. On the contrary, it was scary and disgusting. Arthur would hug her in public, say he was happy, declare his love. But Sarah remembered how he locked her in the attic, humiliated her. He never raised a hand to her, but she saw in his eyes how he restrained himself. Sarah understood that someday he would snap. She was 100% sure. And who knows, maybe then she would meet the fate of the first wife. Everyone would say she fell down the stairs. Time passed. Her belly grew. She knew she was carrying a girl. Arthur hoped for a son, was a little disappointed. But Sarah was happy. What if a son turned out to be like his father? How could she love him then? But a girl would most likely be like her. Arthur restrained himself with all his might, scolded his wife, but no longer locked her in the attic, saying that as soon as she gave birth, she would get what was coming to her. But for now, she needed to be taken care of. These words frightened Sarah. "I suppose I resigned myself to this life," the girl admitted. "I adapted. I understood that if you played by Arthur's rules, you could live. Many husbands beat their wives where I'm from. It's almost normal. But Arthur never hit me once, and I had everything I wanted. I just had to ask. The other thing was that in such conditions, she didn't particularly want anything. Sarah resigned herself to her fate, prepared to become a mother, and tried to be a good wife to Arthur. It seemed to her that her whole life was predetermined. But one day, she accidentally overheard her husband talking to his mistress. The fact that Arthur had affairs on the side wasn't news. He didn't hide it. He would come home drunk in the morning, smelling of perfume, and fall onto the bed. It never occurred to Sarah to object. The less attention he paid to her, the better. What jealousy could there be? It happened at night. Sarah's stomach hurt. She couldn't sleep. She stroked her belly. Arthur was in his study, working. Sarah never delved into his affairs. Suddenly the phone rang. 2 in the morning. People don't call just like that. Her husband's voice was soft, gentle. Sarah had never heard him speak like that. He called the person on the other end affectionate names. My love, Beauty, Brenda. It was so unusual that Sarah forgot about the pain. Well, who knew Arthur could be like that? I've missed you so much, Arthur confessed. The person on the other end. Of course I miss you too, but I have a lot of work, and I need to keep an eye on my wife. She's a silly, naive girl. She's carrying my child. She might do something wrong, harm it. Yes, I agree, it's unfair, but that's how it turned out. Sarah was angered that Arthur spoke of her like that. Silly girl, as if she were an idiot. The man continued. Yes, as soon as she gives birth, we'll be together. We'll take the child from her. She can go wherever she pleases. Yes, I promise. Sarah's mind raced. The puzzle was coming together. The picture was grim. Arthur had a mistress, Brenda, for whom he had strong feelings. Why didn't he marry her? Why marry a naive girl? Apparently, Brenda couldn't have children, and he needed an heir. Arthur married young Sarah to use her as an incubator and then kick her out. He was the local king. He could do what he wanted. He would push her back to her parents, and they would scold her for not being a good wife. And her child, her little daughter, would be raised by a stranger, Brenda. The little one stirred gently in her belly. Tenderness flooded the future mother's heart. No, she wouldn't give this child to anyone. Sarah already loved her little one. But Arthur, he was strong, influential. He had connections everywhere. Sarah wouldn't dare to utter a sound. She would be accused of failing her duties. Perhaps they would find a diagnosis or substances in her purse. Arthur had long arms. He was one of the town's masters. Since there was nowhere to escape the influential husband in town, there was only one option: to run away as far as possible. But where to run? Where and how to live? How to explain her disappearance? She was due to give birth in a couple of months. She needed to settle down. Wandering alone was one thing, with a baby in her arms was another. But staying with Arthur was dangerous. He was a terrible person. While she was carrying his child, maybe he wouldn't touch her. But what would happen when he wanted to take the baby, and Sarah started to resist? She wasn't going to find out. The next morning, Sarah gathered all the jewelry her husband had given her and took it to a pawn shop. The money would be enough for a few months of living in a different city. But then she would need income, and working with a baby in her arms would be unlikely. She decided to solve problems as they arose. As long as she had money, she would see what happened next. Sarah packed her things in a travel bag, added some baby clothes. She didn't want to leave anything belonging to the child. She dressed inappropriately for the weather. She left her winter clothes so Arthur wouldn't immediately notice her absence. She put on an autumn jacket and sneakers, deciding it was fine, as she would be traveling by taxi. Arthur had left on business. He was often away from home. Sarah took advantage of the moment, called a taxi, and went to the bus station. There, she got on the first bus she saw, which took her to Eleanor's city. Fate. At the station, I realized I had been robbed, Sarah continued. Most likely, when I was getting on the bus. There was a crowd at the entrance, a crush. That's when someone took my wallet. And Sarah was left with nothing, without money or support in a strange city, and dressed inappropriately for a frosty December. A desperate situation. I went to the nearest mall, Sarah said. At least it was warm there. I had some change left in my pocket, enough for lunch, but I had no idea what to do next. I knew one thing. I couldn't go home. Arthur had already noticed my absence and was furious. I didn't even want to think about what he might do. So you just arrived today? Eleanor clarified. Yes, this afternoon. I was incredibly lucky that you took me in.
Let's use you, Eleanor smiled. I'm more used to it. Okay, Sarah agreed shyly. He'll look for me, of course, but I don't think he'll immediately realize I'm not in town. Now he'll start shaking down relatives and friends. By the time he figures it out, I'll be in a place where he won't find any trace. Although I don't know how. Listen, what if he goes to the police? You'll be put on a wanted list. They'll find you quickly. He won't. I left him a note asking him not to look for me, and the same for my parents. I explained that I left on my own, but he will look. He doesn't need me, but the child. Sarah gently stroked her belly.
Eleanor, despite the tension, smiled. This girl would be a good mother. But what should she do with her? How could she help? Here's what, Eleanor said. Stay with me for now. If anyone asks, I'll say you're a distant relative from the village. It's unlikely anyone will be curious. I don't socialize with the neighbors. So live here and don't worry about anything. Until summer at least, and then we'll see. Maybe something will become clear. Really? Sarah's face lit up with a smile. She became even more charming. Her eyes sparkled and dimples appeared. Of course, Eleanor nodded. Where else would you go in your condition? To the police, as I understand it, is not an option. There's no crime. All that's left is to hide. Arthur won't think of looking for you at a complete stranger's house. I don't know what to say. Words aren't enough to express my gratitude. If it weren't for you, my child and I probably wouldn't be here. We would have frozen under a fence. Everything will be fine, Eleanor smiled. It was nice to feel like a savior. Now she wasn't alone. There was a person in the house who needed her attention and care. And soon, a little one would be born. True happiness. Days flowed by. Eleanor went to the factory. Sarah stayed home, not idle. She cleaned, cooked, sewed diapers on Eleanor's sewing machine. Eleanor returned home in a different mood. Bought something tasty for Sarah, because she needed positive emotions. There were always vegetables and fruits in the refrigerator now. Pregnant women needed vitamins. In the evenings, they watched TV or talked about everything under the sun. The young girl turned out to be a pleasant conversationalist with an easygoing nature. She told Eleanor everything that was on her mind, shared her innermost secrets. I've never even been this open with my mother, Sarah admitted. And you understand me and support me. Eleanor was pleased by these words. She felt almost like this girl's mother. By age, she could well have been her daughter. And Eleanor sincerely didn't understand how Sarah's parents could do that to her, why she had to seek refuge with strangers and not her own family. Did her mother and father really not understand what a happiness it was to have such a sweet, kind daughter? One day, Sarah told her about Mark, a boy from her class with whom she had a romance in school. He's wonderful. He courted me so beautifully. Her eyes shone at the mention of his name. It was clear that feelings remained. Can you imagine Mark, for my sake, while still in school, went to work part-time at a car repair shop to earn money for movies, cafes, gifts. He was ready for anything. Sarah loved him too. They made plans. Then Mark went into the army, and when he returned, she was married. Mark was upset, angry, then he understood. He came to Sarah, urged her to run away. I wanted to do it so much, Sarah recalled. Run away with Mark far away, where no one would find us. But then I realized I couldn't. Arthur would definitely find us. Mark wouldn't be able to get a job officially because Arthur would find out immediately. He had connections everywhere. I don't even know what Arthur would have done to him, to both of us. I didn't want to ruin Mark's life. He didn't deserve it. I had to refuse. What a sad and romantic story. Eleanor sighed. Things like that happen not just in movies. Well, what about Mark? Mark. He was offended. He decided that I chose an old rich husband and a comfortable life, that I betrayed our feelings. It was painful, but I didn't try to convince him otherwise. It's even better for him to think that way. Otherwise, he would have tried to save me, and that would have ended badly. A month passed unnoticed. The due date was approaching. Everything in Eleanor's house was ready for the baby's arrival. The woman eagerly awaited this moment. Would a child finally appear here? Incredible. Her father's study was converted into a nursery. A crib bought for pennies was set up. Eleanor sewed the bedding herself from soft pink fabric, made a canopy. It turned out to be a beautiful crib for a princess. She often admired it, imagining Sarah putting the tiny girl here. Sarah couldn't give birth in a hospital. Arthur had surely given a description. Eleanor arranged with an experienced midwife who would come when called. The pregnancy went well. Home births had become popular, so it wasn't anything unusual. Sarah was immensely grateful to Eleanor, assuring her that she would definitely repay her. Eleanor just smiled. Sarah didn't even realize how much she was already doing by trusting her and brightening her loneliness. Besides Sarah, Eleanor felt needed, useful, strong. One day, Eleanor returned from work early. The power went out at the factory. On the way, she stopped at a store, bought groceries and Sarah's favorite fruit yogurt. She opened the door with her key, quietly stepped inside. What if Sarah was sleeping? Lately, she slept often, gathering strength. The house was silent. And then, Sarah's voice came from behind the closed bedroom door. She was talking on the phone, and her voice was harsh, firm, even commanding. She had never spoken like that before. Eleanor involuntarily froze, listening. "You want your child? Prepare the money," Sarah instructed the person on the other end. "What you've paid isn't enough. If the required amount isn't here within 3 days, I'll fall from the windowsill onto the railing, and that's it. You won't prove anything. I just accidentally slipped. My belly pulled me over." Eleanor shrank back from the door. What was happening? Was this the sweet, quiet Sarah speaking? Who was she demanding money from? Arthur? But it was his child. And Sarah was afraid of him. She would hardly have called him. What then? "You think faster. If you throw another pittance hoping to stall until the birth, then I'll give birth. What else can I do? But I'll leave the baby at an orphanage. You won't even know which city. Can you imagine how many abandoned babies there are in such institutions? You'll get tired of searching. And there's little time. Healthy newborns are quickly adopted." The image of this new Sarah didn't fit with the modest girl. This one was tough, audacious, a master manipulator, threatening. Sarah hung up and dialed another number. Her voice was now friendly, gentle. Eleanor caught every word. She had to understand who she had taken in. "Yes, Mark. I called them." "No, I'm sure." "Yes, you're right. I know how to talk to them. That's exactly how I talked. If they want to see their daughter alive, they'll bring the money to the agreed place. And you keep an eye on the spot, okay? Just be careful and cautious. They might involve the police, although unlikely after I scared them." "Yes, I'm doing well." "No, this simpleton doesn't suspect anything. She's easy to handle, takes care of me, feeds me goodies. Can you imagine?" "You were right. She's a pushover." "I feel good." "Yes, Eleanor crept on tiptoe to the front door. The conversation was ending. She didn't want Sarah to realize she had been overheard. She was simply afraid of her reaction. And she didn't know what to do. She went out into the yard, walked to the gazebo. The family used to spend wonderful evenings here. Now Eleanor sat here alone, trying to comprehend what she had heard. So Sarah was not who she pretended to be at all, not a downtrodden victim, but a monster in sheep's clothing, demanding money. How skillfully she told stories, a talented actress, and Eleanor had opened her heart to her. Oh, she really was a simpleton. And Sarah had an accomplice, Mark. So, he existed. Perhaps that was the only truth. Everything else was questionable. Why was Sarah willing to sacrifice the child? Was she lying? Why was someone willing to pay? Maybe Arthur wasn't a tyrant, but a victim. Eleanor knew one thing. She couldn't let Sarah know that she knew everything. This girl was a monster. It was easy to believe her, a defenseless, fragile, pregnant creature. But Eleanor couldn't stay in the same house with her overnight. On the spot, she invented a story about a business trip from the factory. This had never happened, but how would Sarah know? She had been with her for just over a month. Eleanor called a friend, asked to stay the night, said she was having her apartment fumigated for cockroaches. One problem solved. All that remained was to warn Sarah in a way she would believe. A business trip? Great, Sarah smiled, listening to Eleanor. It must be interesting. When I put my daughter in kindergarten, I'll get a job too. Can't wait. You'll have time, Eleanor smiled, trying to seem natural. By evening, Eleanor had made a decision. Of course, she had to go to the police. Owen worked there, a colleague's eldest son. Eleanor had known him since childhood. He wouldn't refuse. After saying goodbye to Sarah, they even hugged, Eleanor went to the nearest police station. On the way, she called Owen, explained that she had something to tell him. He met her on the steps. "Hello, Aunt Eleanor," Owen said happily. "Come in, I'll show you my office." Eleanor smiled. This young man was calling her aunt. Yes, she was already an adult. How hard it was to get used to that. In the office, sitting on a hard chair, Eleanor told Owen everything. He listened attentively. In uniform and with a serious face, he looked unusually grown up. After she finished, Owen asked if she had a photo of the girl. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "We took a photo on New Year's Eve." She took out her phone, found a selfie where she and Sarah were sitting arm in arm, smiling. "Her face looks familiar," Owen said thoughtfully. "I'll transfer the photo to the computer and run it through the database. I'll contact you later, okay?" "Okay, thank you so much." "You're welcome for now," Owen shrugged. With a sense of duty done, Eleanor went to her friend's place. She had done everything she could. Now whatever would be, would be. She had 2 days of business trip. Maybe something would be clarified during that time. It was clarified much sooner. Owen called the next day after lunch. "Well, Aunt Eleanor, we got your—" Eleanor couldn't believe her ears. "Sarah, you mean?" "It's not Sarah, it's Diane. Come to the station after work. I'll tell you everything. Thanks to you, I've solved a major case. Thank you." "You're welcome," Eleanor replied mechanically and hung up. She couldn't wait until the end of the workday. She went to the workshop manager and asked for permission to leave. She didn't do this very often. She called a taxi to get to the truth faster. Owen met her on the steps again. His eyes were shining, a smile on his face. Eleanor was in his office again. He didn't delay, started telling the story immediately. As he spoke, Eleanor's eyes widened. She expected anything but this. Sarah turned out to be Diane. She was indeed born in a small town, in a large family, and dreamed of getting rich, just like her friend Mark. Together they came up with a plan. A wealthy businessman named Arthur lived in their town, but he wasn't thinking of marrying Diane. He had a wife named Carol. Their marriage was almost 20 years old. Everything was fine. Only Carol couldn't have children. Arthur sent her to the best clinics, brought in doctors from abroad, but nothing helped. Diane knew about this, working part-time as an orderly at the local reproduction center. She saw Arthur and Carol, knew their situation. At the right moment, she approached the distraught Carol and offered her services. "I can carry a child for you," the girl said. "I heard about your situation. I feel sorry for you. And I need money. I'm young, healthy. I can do it. Carol looked at her distrustfully, but took her number. The unhappy woman was ready to do anything to become a mother. She realized she couldn't carry the child herself. What difference did it make who carried it, as long as there was a child? Arthur supported his wife. Diane was implanted with Arthur and Carol's embryo. The child took. Diane was initially an ideal surrogate mother, following all instructions. And then she disappeared. She vanished from the town, leaving Carol and Arthur in the dark. They were already picturing themselves as parents, had prepared the nursery. Carol wept. Arthur searched for the runaway. No one understood what had happened. But soon, everything became clear. The disappearance of the surrogate mother was part of Diane and Mark's plan. Diane wasn't just going to give birth and hand over the child. She had been promised a sum for a large apartment, but they wanted more, to extort a fortune from Arthur. The pair were planning to go to Thailand, buy an apartment there, and live happily ever after. Diane needed to hide. She had no money for rent, but Mark knew that Eleanor lived in a neighboring city, a lonely, trusting woman who was easy to deceive. He found out about her from an acquaintance at her factory. He happened to mention that they had such an Eleanor, who dreamed of a child. Mark, the cunning fox, seized on the information, found out everything. They watched Eleanor for several days and staged the accidental meeting. "Sorry, Aunt Eleanor, but you really did act foolishly," Owen said.
I know. Eleanor didn't argue. It was true. Diane called Arthur. He left money at agreed locations. Mark picked it up. They had accumulated a fortune, but greed ruined them, and chance helped. Eleanor returned early, overheard the conversation. The rest was clear. Eleanor left the photo. Owen ran it through the database, found a match. Arthur had contacted the police, cautiously, without fuss, so Diane wouldn't see the photo and harm the child. Well, Eleanor said slowly, what happens now? Now everything is fine. Diane is where she should be, under supervision. Right now, she's giving birth in the prison infirmary. The baby is about to arrive. Diane won't have time to do anything. Then the baby will be given to the parents. That's the little one's fate. Didn't even have time to be born and has already been through so much. Giving birth right now? Eleanor became anxious. She had a crib at home for this baby. The infant's fate was not indifferent to her. Can I find out if the baby is okay? Of course, Aunt Eleanor, I'll call you back. Don't worry, go home. We made an arrest there. Your place is probably a mess. The guys tracked dirt in. It's okay. The house greeted her with silence. Eleanor had gotten used to having the smiling Sarah, that is, Diane, living there. And now she was alone again. There would be no shared dinners or conversations. No warm infant would be placed in the crib prepared with love. Yes, Sarah Diane had managed to inflict a wound on the woman who had naively taken her in. And Arthur and Carol. Eleanor couldn't imagine what the parents felt, who had dreamed of a child and almost lost it. But they would be fine. Their daughter was about to be born, and thanks to her, Eleanor, the girl would be in the safe hands of loving parents, not criminals for whom she was just a thing. So, it wasn't all in vain. Eleanor sighed, filled a bucket with water, and began washing the floors. The police officers had indeed tracked dirt in from the street. Eleanor walked over to Annie and picked her up. The girl was growing quickly, had become quite heavy, but it was a pleasant weight. The little one hugged Eleanor's neck with her small hands and kissed her cheek. At that moment, Eleanor was the happiest person in the world. She knew the girl sincerely loved her and missed her when the nanny took a day off. Eleanor herself missed Annie very much and tried not to leave unnecessarily, but sometimes there were urgent matters. The mean aunt visited me in my dream again, Annie whispered confidentially into Eleanor's ear. She wanted to take me away. It's just a dream, the woman smiled, tucking a fallen strand of light hair behind her ear. I know, But that aunt often comes in my dreams. She's beautiful, but mean. Eleanor sighed. Annie couldn't know about what happened shortly before her birth. It was impossible. But why did she repeatedly dream of a mean, beautiful aunt who looked like Diane? Eleanor had discussed this with Carol, the girl's mother, and they didn't know what to think. Could the little one have somehow sensed and remembered something while in the surrogate mother's womb? Eleanor became very good friends with Carol. They were the same age and shared similar views, understood each other well, because both had dreamed of motherhood and experienced the pain associated with it. Carol managed to become a mother, and Eleanor was now the baby's godmother and her nanny. Carol and Arthur worked a lot, and someone needed to look after the girl. After everything that had happened, the couple were afraid to hire someone off the street. They didn't want to let strangers near the child. They had already had a sad experience. The idea of getting to know the woman who saved Annie better came from Arthur. He reasoned that Eleanor was a very kind and responsible person, since she had taken in the pregnant Diane. Naive, of course, but that was better than cunning. Arthur and Carol came to Eleanor one evening, 2 weeks after Diane was arrested. They brought the sleeping baby with them. Eleanor couldn't take her eyes off her for a long time, smiled, was happy that the girl was in the hands of loving parents. The couple thanked Eleanor for helping to expose Diane and Mark. "If it weren't for you, I can't imagine what would have happened to our Annie, to us," Carol said, her voice trembling. Tears were in her beautiful turquoise eyes. It was clear she hadn't fully processed the situation yet. "But what? What did I do?" Eleanor said, embarrassed. "It was a coincidence that I came back in time. Just a fortunate turn of events. It must be fate." "We have a business proposal for you," Arthur announced. "We're looking for a nanny for the baby, and you are someone we can trust. How does that sound?" Eleanor was speechless. Joy overwhelmed her. In those few minutes, she had become attached to Annie and grown fond of these kind, polite people. Such a proposal. There was nothing to think about. Of course, she agreed. And so, 3 years had passed. Eleanor lived in a guest house belonging to Arthur and Carol and happily looked after Annie. Finally, her dream had come true, albeit in a peculiar way. She hadn't become a kindergarten teacher or a mother, as she had wanted, but she had a beloved girl to care for and reliable, understanding friends, Arthur and Carol. Close people. Now Eleanor was not alone. The woman carried Annie into the house, sat her at the table, and put a bowl of oatmeal with fruit in front of her. "Well, a fairy tale?" Eleanor asked. "Yes, a fairy tale." The little one clapped her hands happily. "About a princess who was taken away by a wicked witch, but then everything turned out well." "Okay then," Eleanor smiled. "Listen, just don't forget to eat." Annie nodded and began eating her porridge diligently. Eleanor couldn't help but smile again. She was truly happy.